It's always fun to see developers taking swings and trying out new ideas, especially when they're, good ideas. But of course, they're not always good ideas, or at least they're ideas that have been let down by poor execution. And every so often, we see developers listening to the inevitable criticism for such implementations and dropping those features and mechanics entirely when they move on to the sequel, instead of trying out something else based on the feedback from audiences and critics. The MAKO in Mass Effect 2. Being able to move around on alien planets and moons in a massive tank sounds like such a great idea on paper. Simple, yes, and not out of the box by any means, but it's something that just sounds appealing. Mass Effect's MAKO sections, however, were famously terrible. The environments were barren and repetitive, combat in the MAKO felt rather uninteresting, and worst of all, actually driving the vehicle was a bit of a nightmare. The first game's MAKO sections were one of the few parts of the game that received heavy criticism, and of course BioWare went on to drop it completely in Mass Effect 2, replacing it with the much more simplified probe mining mechanic, which wasn't exactly a huge hit either, but it at least wasn't actively obnoxious, like the MAKO sections tended to be. Mass Effect Legendary Edition did end up making some improvements to the MAKO, and Mass Effect Andromeda's open-world driving was a step up over it as well, even though it wasn't exactly spectacular. Even so, it's fair to say that Mass Effect as a series has never really managed to do vehicles right. Fallout 4's dialogue system in Fallout 76 Wastelanders. Nobody will deny that Fallout 4 is, at the very least, a solid game. A large section of the series' fanbase criticizes Fallout 4's excessive streamline and how much it de-emphasized RPG mechanics to deliver an experience where player expression became much more restricted. The game's dialogue system was perfectly emblematic of that. Instead of giving players a list of responses to choose from, Fallout 4 instead assigned dialogue choices to face buttons, which meant that you were limited to a maximum of 4 choices at any given time. Worse still, quite often the choices didn't differentiate from each other all that much, and felt extremely simplified as compared to what the series has generally been known for. Now, Fallout 76 is far from a perfect game, and it made several changes and additions itself that it obviously shouldn't have. But it has been getting progressively better with its expansions. The first major expansion, Wastelanders, was a solid enough piece of content, and the fact that it had a proper, traditional Fallout dialogue system was a massive point in its favor. Underwater sections in Monster Hunter 4. Monster Hunter 3 was a pretty lean game at launch, especially by Monster Hunter standards. And it didn't help that one of the game's biggest new additions ended up being one of the worst received elements. A huge chunk of Monster Hunter 3 players despised the underwater sections, from the significantly hampered movement to certain weapons not functioning properly underwater to just how clunky it all feels, especially if you end up taking on multiple monsters at once. Underwater sections in Monster Hunter 3 were a failed experiment, and were even worse in Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, where players also had to contend with the 3DS's cramped and limited controls. Multiplayer in God of War 2018. Remember those 3 or 4 years in the early 2010s where every game felt the need to have a multiplayer component? God of War was one of many franchises that fell victim to that, and it's no surprise that it ended up chasing that trend in its most underwhelming game. God of War Ascension had a lot of issues all around, even in its single-player campaign, but the multiplayer was an unsurprising disappointment, mildly enjoyable at best, and very infrequently, and just a mess at worst. God of War 2018 ended up changing a lot, of course, and basically tore up the rulebook and started fresh. And thankfully, one of the many things it did away with was Ascension's baffling need to have a multiplayer component. HMs and Pokemon Black and White. For a long time, HMs, or hidden machines, were a staple of the Pokemon formula, essentially serving as roadblocks in the world to impede progress until you had a specific move to be able to get past it. A lot of people didn't like HMs, largely because most of them were rather useless in actual battles, though some can admittedly be pretty nifty. And because they're permanent moves that couldn't be forgotten, which meant one of the Pokemon in your party ends up having to sacrifice a move slot to learn what is most likely a useless attack, or worse still, you end up losing one party slot to a designated HM slave. With Pokemon Black and White, Game Freak ended up streamlining the Pokemon formula in various ways, and one of the many things they trimmed were HMs. Sure, the games still had HMs, but rather than being critical roadblocks, they were now entirely optional. Since Black and White, with the exception of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, HMs have either been heavily downplayed, like in Pokemon X and Y, or entirely missing, like in Sun and Moon and Sword and Shield. Then again, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl probably will have HMs, so we're not entirely free of them just yet. Motion controls in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword made a lot of mistakes. It was excessively linear, it held the player's hand too much, its pacing was all over the place, and of course, it relied way too heavily on motion controls. That was basically every Nintendo game during the Wii era, of course, but motion controls in Skyward Sword could be particularly problematic at times, for all the most predictable reasons. Having to deal with inaccurate movements and unresponsive controls isn't exactly an ideal situation in any game. Of course, Breath of the Wild was a complete refresh for the series, much like God of War 2018 was for its own series. And though it is most certainly not a traditional Zelda experience, it thankfully does have traditional controls. As Super Mario Odyssey proves well enough, Nintendo has no qualms with shoving motion controls even into Switch games, so we're glad they had the good sense to at least keep that far away from Breath of the Wild. Co-op in Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Co-op missions in Assassin's Creed isn't a terrible idea. In fact, with the right execution, it could have been quite interesting. Assassin's Creed Unity, however, was the game where things went spectacularly wrong for the franchise in many ways, one of which ended up being what was also one of the game's biggest new additions. Playing with randoms online was an absolute mess, predictably enough, but even playing with people you know wasn't exactly ever a blast, and going into the missions for nothing but gear improvements at a time when Assassin's Creed formula wasn't that focused on gear just made it all seem a little pointless. Unity's successor, Syndicate, ended up significantly improving upon its predecessor in many ways, and is, in fact, one of the series' best games. Unsurprisingly, its removal of co-op to focus instead on single-player content turned out to be a good move. Loot boxes in Need for Speed Heat. EA was on a bit of a destructive rampage with its microtransactions for a good while, until not that long ago, and in 2017 their games were at their worst when it came to monetization. That was the year when Star Wars Battlefront 2 came out, of course, but another major EA title in 2017 that came under fire for its monetization was Need for Speed Payback. Of course, that was far from the only thing that game came under fire for, but what could otherwise have been at least a decent racer was hamstrung by aggressive microtransactions and loot box mechanics. Need for Speed Heat righted those wrongs, dropping that excessive focus on microtransactions and instead emphasizing cars, customization, and high-speed events, and it was a significantly better game for it. Esports focus in Gran Turismo 7. Sure, Gran Turismo 7 isn't out yet, but already series fans can be assured that it will address one of Gran Turismo Sport's biggest issues when it came out. Sure, Polyphony Digital eventually turned it into a solid racing sim, but when it launched, GT Sport was all about esports and competitive online play, which meant that things such as a vast roster of vehicles and even a regular single-player campaign were missing from the game. The upcoming Gran Turismo 7 is being touted as a traditional GT title, dropping that esports focus to instead go back to focusing on the actual vehicles and, yes, its single-player campaign. Sure, all of its online requirements are a bit disappointing, but it's still great to see Gran Turismo going back to what it's excellent at. Random tripping in Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS. Super Smash Bros. Melee is an irreplaceable legend as far as competitive fighting games go, a game so mechanically perfect that the competitive scene sticks to it to this day. Its sequel, Brawl, was an excellent game in its own right, but since it messed with Melee's competitive brilliance, it ended up being a little divisive in a few ways. One particular new mechanic that Brawl introduced that is emblematic of its controversial changes was random tripping. Essentially, there were certain actions where you always had a small chance of randomly tripping for no reason, rendering your fighter vulnerable for a brief window. It's not hard to understand why random tripping proved to be controversial, And similarly, it wasn't exactly a surprise to see Nintendo make corrections in Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS. That and Ultimate both do still have tripping, of course, but thankfully the random element remains exclusive to Brawl. That's all for now. If you enjoy what you saw, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, now is a great time to subscribe. We upload brand new videos every single day. After subscribing, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time, right here on Gaming Bolt.